Okay, so we're going to go through a few practices of what the graphing final will really look like. And so find the worksheet that is talking about the price of studio apartments. So first thing you need to do is actually, well, read the directions, answer all the questions, and then read the scenario. The rent price of a studio apartment is determined by market forces. Currently, the demand and supply schedules are as follows. And the first instructions say, graph the demand curve and the supply curve. Then, there's two different instructions here, and that's one of the tricky things about the final. There's several different instructions on one same line. I can't change that, make them separate lines. You've got to read everything very carefully. Now, to graph the demand curve, we're going to use these two columns, and later when we graph the supply curve, we're going to use these two columns. But the very first thing you need to do is make sure that you title your graph. Even though it doesn't say that in there, you're expected to do it. So hopefully I've been training you to do that. So what is this about? Rental of studio apartments. Okay? So studio apartment rentals. That's our title. Okay, now I'm going to graph these points of demand and pause this. You do the same. Okay, so if you graphed your demand curve, yours should look something like this. Now we're going to graph the supply curve using these two columns. I'm going to pause. So, did you label your supply curve S1? Does yours look like this? Now, next, write out the equilibrium price and quantity demanded by market forces of, I've already messed up. I did not mark and label the equilibrium point. See, again, they put more than one instruction on a line, and it can really trip you up. Make sure you follow all the instructions. So I'm going to mark my equilibrium point. And you should do the same. Maybe I'll use something that shows up a little better. There you go. All right. Now, what do I need to do here? I need to write out what I just found by graphing. So, and yes, you do need to write this out in full sentences and full words, not abbreviations. Okay, so equilibrium price is $1,000. Remember, this can get tricky if it says in hundreds. You might want to check your chart. Equilibrium quantity is, again, these numbers are in hundreds, so that's not a 5. That's 500 studio apartment rentals. Now, suppose there was an earthquake in San Francisco and a third of the homes are destroyed. Due to our proximity to San Francisco, many of its refugees would likely move here. So how will this affect the market for studio apartments in Sacramento? Now, there's two things they want here. They want how would it affect it, and explain why. Think of your quizzes. There were two different boxes you had to write things in. Write the stuff that you would put in those two boxes. So, how would this affect the market? Would that affect demand or supply? And how would it affect? Pause. Okay. So there's two different things here. What's going to happen to the market? Demand would increase. And why? Because there's an increase in number of consumers. That's your determinant of demand that applies to this scenario. Now, how do you know whether it's demand or supply? You have to memorize all those determinants and know the difference between a supply determinant and a demand determinant. Okay, now show this change by drawing your new curve on the graph from 1A, meaning this graph. Now we need a new curve. We need to show that demand increased. Now, then, once I showed the new demand curve, then I have to do another thing. I need to mark and label the new equilibrium. Don't forget to do that. Oh, that's not that. Now here's this arbitrary situation. Demand and supply hasn't changed, but somebody is doing something that is not natural to the market. So now suppose that after this event, landlords continue to rent studio apartments at that old price, $1,000 a month. Will a shortage or surplus of studio apartments in Sacramento? So now we need to do that price thing where we just put a price line all the way across the graph, because this isn't an equilibrium thing. This is just some arbitrary price that someone has set. So $1,000 is the price. So this is where we're at, $1,000. Add 2 zeros because these are in hundreds. So here's where this weird arbitrary price is. And again, this is why different colors are so useful. We bring it all the way across the graph. It's not an equilibrium price. We're calling it just this P, and where are we at numbers? This was first, this is second. This is P3. This is just some random price. Ooh, more tricky because I put my demand curve so far over. All right. So now I've got to show where this price touches the demand curve and where it touches the supply curve. Here is, forget about this demand curve. This demand curve doesn't exist anymore. Here is where it touches the new demand curve. So I'm going to call this quantity demanded, match it with my number. And here is where it touches the supply curve. But again, it's not equilibrium right now because equilibrium's up here now. So I'm going to call this quantity touching the supply curve, supplied, match the number. All right, so then the last step, first of all, what's going on here? Will there be a shortage or surplus? So you follow your rules. What is there going to be? Quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded, which means there's a shortage. By how much? Ooh, I'm going to say this is about a 12 minus 5, 7. And so my shortage is 7. Actually, they're not asking for the amount of the shortage here. All I have to do is explain. So it's a shortage because quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. So I can put that here. Because quantity supplied is less than quantity demanded. Then lastly, they give me one more scenario. And now here's a new scenario. Suppose that a new apartment complex was built in downtown Sacramento. Is that a demand thing or a supply thing? Okay, and is that going to increase or decrease supply? All right, so now I'm going to draw one more curve. We now have an increase in supply because somebody has just built a new apartment complex. So here's my new supply curve. Okay, S2 and equilibrium. This is now, we've got to find the two twos. This supply curve doesn't exist anymore. This demand curve doesn't exist anymore. We have to find the two latest ones. So this is where equilibrium is. Your two twos, that's where you mark this final scenario. You find your D2 and your S2 to do this one. Otherwise, you'll lose that point on that final equilibrium, which is the one that most people lose because they lose track of where they're at. So here is equilibrium quantity. We're now up to number 4. And again, make sure you find those two twos. And here we have equilibrium price 4.